1, 2, 3.
Welcome to Scéalta. My name is Joe Austin. Can I remind those who have joined us that Scéalta is a joint production of Faculty Affairs to Hear and Feeling Fubble. My guest this evening is Kevin Meagher. It's good to see you again. The last time I saw you, you were here for a fella. And I actually have a wee bit of difficulty in how I should describe you. So let me just run through the gamut and you tell me where I've got it wrong. So
okay.
You're a partner? Is that true?
What, sorry?
You're a partner to Lucy?
Yes, Lucy, yeah, my wife, yeah.
I like to start at the important bits. So you're a partner to Lucy. 2 children or 3?
2, I've got 2, a boy and a girl.
You haven't heard the news yet? You may have 3 before the end of the programme. You're in Sheffield?
I am, I live in Sheffield.
Okay, so you are an author, a published author, I should say. You contribute to The Guardian, The New Statesman. You are the assistant or sub-editor of Labour Uncut. You are a habitual blogger, I should add. And I also know that you're a Labour activist. You're someone who is described quite often as part of the conscience of the Labour movement. And that's a very flattering thing to be called.
That would be very flattering, yeah.
And you're an economist, or at least you have that interest. So is that fair enough?
It is. I mean, I do all these things, I have to say, as more as hobbies than anything else these days. I have other jobs I do as well, but I think I'm like a lot of people in the digital age, where you orbit around politics while not necessarily being a politician. If you see what I mean, there's lots more scope these days for people to be involved in the discussion, to engage with it, to hopefully lend some expertise or some perspective to discussions in a way that 20 years ago you couldn't have done that. Really, you couldn't, before the media started to proliferate and splinter and specialize. There are all kinds of publications these days, and there are obviously plenty in Belfast as well, looking at politics in very specific terms, and that gives a lot of opportunity for people like me that have hopefully got some expertise in different aspects to come in and get involved in the discussion, as I say, in a way that you couldn't have done really 20 years ago, because you had the big traditional media and that was it. Now everybody can get involved and have a say. And, you look even just in Northern Ireland's politics, the work that for example, Slugger O'Toole does as a blog, pulling in all kinds of strands of opinion and expertise. Fascinating to read and to sort of pick all that up and pick all that nuance up in a way that you would never have been able to see that or hear that 20 years ago. So hopefully I'm part of that kind of milieu.
I want to talk later on in the interview about your new book, which I believe is out in April, I think. Yeah. But before I do, the last time that I seen you in person, your father had brought you to Fela, or should I say, you accompanied your father to Fela? Maybe that's more growing up.
Yeah, no, we come as a double act. We tend to Kevin Senior. So we try and make any of these occasions as social as possible, if I can put it euphemistically.
Tell me a wee bit about your background. Obviously, you're Sheffield at the moment, but you're obviously from an Irish background.
Yeah. So I'd be classically, I guess, 3rd generation Irish. My grandparents were all born in Ireland. Paternal grandfather in Kilkenny, and my maternal grandfather in Tuam in Galway. And as far back as you like, on all sides of my family, we go back to Ireland in every direction, basically. So I'm sort of classically in that space of being 3rd generation Irish. Obviously, my surname tends to present people with difficulties, and I made a point the other day. Somebody mentioned this about mispronouncing people's names and how often that's a frustration of people. And I said, well, literally every single day of my life, every new person that I've ever met, apart from an Irish person, and even some Irish people get it wrong as well, have mispronounced my name. And it's a talking point, and it's a constant reminder as well that sort of says this is what your heritage is, and this is where you're from, and some people may give in and spell the name Maher, but we're quite stubborn and we're hangouts, so we go for the full thing. So that's a constant reminder, and I'm like a lot of people, I suspect, in Britain, that if you look at the numbers of people that have got an Irish grandparent or an Irish great-grandparent or great-grandparent, it more than swamps the numbers of people in the whole of the island of Ireland that have got an Irish grandparent or great-grandparent, which is a curiosity. So there's always been a very vibrant Irish community in Britain, in the big towns and the big cities. And I'm originally from Bolton in Lancashire. So everybody I can think of in Lancashire seems to have Irish connections. And the further west you go towards Liverpool and Merseyside, the more Irish the place becomes. And Manchester, Preston, right the way across then to Leeds and to Birmingham particularly, and London of course, and Bristol, have got big Irish heritage communities. And I find myself living in Sheffield, which is interesting because it used to have a little island in the centre of the in the centre of the city, which would have clustered around one of the big Catholic churches there, and that's all been changed with the slum clearances and what have you, and people dissipate, and somebody once suggested to me that effectively being a white ethnic minority, it's very easy for people to kind of, if they want to shake off their heritage, as perhaps lots of people did during the Troubles. It's easy to do that and to kind of disappear. But it's interesting in the last 20 years how people started, I think, to reconnect to the past. And Sheffield's curious because it's not got the obvious Irish community, for example, that Manchester or Liverpool or Birmingham would have, but it's definitely there. And one of the forgotten sons of Sheffield Irish repute is of course Shaun McLaughlin, who was the last Commandant General in 1916, who came and ended up settling in Sheffield. And I'm doing some research on him at the moment, actually, because I think again,
James Connolly actually.
He took over directly from James Connolly. Yeah, absolutely. So,
and I believe went on to involve himself with Labour politics in Sheffield. Can I ask you, a young man growing up towards the tail end of the conflict in Ireland, was it difficult? I mean, obviously, you've never tried to disguise your Irish background. In fact, your name wouldn't allow you to disguise it. But was it difficult as a young man? Did you receive any problems? Or?
There was definitely a tone, I think, throughout the Troubles. I'm born in 1975, so I'm kind of growing up at that kind of second half of it, I guess. And there's that period when to be Irish in Britain mainly was to be synonymous with being Catholic as well. So there was definitely a whiff of anti-popery, if I can put it like that, in those years. It's much less now than perhaps it would have been 30, 35 years ago, but it was definitely there. And I think what you tended to find with the Irish community in Britain is that it kept its head down. It did its thing. It might have clustered around an Irish club in Birmingham, or it might have clustered around a Catholic club in the suburbs of South Manchester, or it might have clustered around a small GAA club in Bolton, which we had as well. So there were specific touch points that people had. And of course, you end up with Britain. You end up with three Irish communities, basically. You end up with people that have come from the south with Irish accents, who've come to that typical post-war generation that came to work and to live in Britain. You end up with some people from the north as well, and then you end up with people like me, typically that with broad Lancashire accents, but with names that require constant pronunciation, and look Irish, and there's lots and lots and lots and lots of people like that in that third category, and it mixes together. And I've done in the past, when I've done Irish community development work, particularly here in Sheffield, it's interesting, those stories and those tales, and there are these quite discrete Irish communities that come together. You'll have people that are still very committed to the church. You'll have people who are not committed to the church. You will have Irish Protestants, and I can think of a friend of mine who's an Irish language enthusiast, and you know, and a kind of staunch Republican, that would have been around, and you know, interested in the history and the culture and the politics, and all this kind of blends together. And we used to have a small St. Patrick's Day parade in Sheffield, which, you know, it didn't take a lot of organising, because basically what we did was to steal the congregation from the St. Patrick's Day Mass at lunchtime, add that together with the atheists outside, get a big Irish wolfhound, and we used to march around the city centre. And the reaction, I thought, seems like a good idea. I've got a ready-made audience here of 250 people. So there's about 250 of us, 300 or so, marching around Sheffield city centre, and then going into the town hall and having a reception there, an Irish dance, and taking over the place, which they were very good about. But it was interesting because there were people, particularly of a certain generation, that thought, oh God, we can't do this. We've got to, you know, the National Front will have a go at us, the BNP will have a go at us. It'll be dangerous. And it's perhaps a generational thing where it's like, believe me, that will not happen. Will be a curiosity for people, and people will be kind of perfectly happy and content to think this is a good thing. And that's perhaps a generational shift of growing up in Britain, in, I suppose I say, in that second half of the Troubles, but also that point that it intersects where all of a sudden you get the peace process, and almost to the week you seem to have a proliferation of Irish theme pubs that open up everywhere in Britain. I mean, they just were everywhere. They've kind of sort of disappeared now, but there's still quite a few around. And all of a sudden, being Irish was kind of cool and you know, trendy and the latest thing. And you know, people, as I say, were reconnecting with, oh, my grandmother was from Ireland. I don't know where, I don't know exactly how, but it's in my retained memory that I've got some of those roots as well. So it's interesting how these things kind of intersected and interplayed. But if you're of a generation that's known to keep your head down, and to be treated perhaps with some suspicion, or to deal with overt racism in the workplace, or to think that, look, you know, the people will take the Troubles out on us and all the rest of it, keep your head down. It's a bit counterintuitive to be marching around a city centre at lunchtime and going in a town hall and having a reception and all the rest of it. But there was never a problem, there was never any trouble, and people, you know, took it all in good part.
You mentioned that coalition of Irish interests, sometimes through work, sometimes through the church, and that generation who just kept their head down for a variety of reasons. Your father, Kevin, what did your father work, or what does he work at? I believe is he still working?
He is. No, he's my dad's 75. He's a bricklayer. He's still working. Yeah, no, he's out every day. But again, that's a perfectly kind of common Irish story as well, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, you know, I came across, was on holiday a few years ago came across an Irish couple in the late 70s, and he was 79, I think, and he was still laying drives, and you know, it's just what the Irish, it's an Irish story. It's just
was there ever
we do.
Was there ever a temptation for you to follow in your, as opposed to going to academia, to follow in your father's footsteps?
Oh no, absolutely. I was working on building sites at 12. I worked all the way through. I was probably the only hod carrier in Britain with a master's degree, which at one time. So you know, and you know, and that was kind of perfectly normal, really. That, you know, to do that from as I say, work from being obviously being quite big, from being kind of 12 onwards, to spend summer holidays and other holidays. And then when I was older, working full time while I was studying, with my dad on the sites. So yeah, it's and there again. I mean, you know, everybody on every building site in Britain seems to be Irish. So you know, that seems to always have been the case.
Can I ask you about? In our introduction, I mentioned your Labour credentials, which are impressive. You know, I have to say, both in terms of an activist and also someone who has an eye to where Labour needs to go and has to go. And I want to ask you just some of your comments about where Labour currently sits. But did Labour find you? Did socialism find you, or did you find it? Can you hear me?
Oh, sorry, I just lost you there a bit, Joe. Just say that again.
Well, let me ask you that question again. I had said in our introduction, just in terms of your involvement with Labour, both as a critic when you saw it necessary, and also as an activist. And also, I have to say, you were a political advisor to Shaun Woodward, who we had here for a while. Did Labour find you, or did you find socialism? Where does that come in?
I mean, I've been a member of the Labour Party since year dot, really, since I was about 16. It's just a natural political home for somebody like me, anyway. And I mean, I think the thing you get, and perhaps one of the different perspectives of British politics as opposed to particularly Irish politics, north or south, is that the British political system is an agglomeration of interests. So if you're a conservative, you might be a free market radical, you might be, a right-wing nationalist, you might just be somebody that thinks they've got the national interest at heart, and you might think that's where I sit. And I sit alongside people I perhaps don't agree with on everything. And it's the same with Labour. You get people who are moderate social democrats, want to change but do it in an evolutionary way. You get more radical socialists and trade unionists that want to do things quicker and with more oomph. And you get people as well, as the fortunes of political parties wax and wane, you get people that kind of jump on and jump off, and both main parties have that. Whereas I suppose, even in the north, you've got such a proliferation of parties that you can find something that perhaps very specifically fits your outlook. Where in Britain you learn to perhaps be a bit more pragmatic and say, look, I'll ride with the punches a bit. I'm in Labour, but there are people within Labour I would disagree with on lots of issues, and they with me. But you realise, actually, look, at the end of the day, after a general election, somebody's going to govern the country, and it's either going to be the leader of the Conservative Party or the leader of the Labour Party, and that's it. So actually, to have influence in one of those parties, or is the only game in town for people like me who see it in those terms.
I mentioned earlier on the real boss and your relationship. Lucy, where did you meet? At university, or?
No. We both used to work for the Labour Party. We were both press officers, so it was a classic kind of meeting at work situation, really. But my wife's a political journalist, and has been a professional journalist from being 17. So she's been doing it for a very long time. But yes, stepped out to do PR for a while and worked for the Labour Party, and that's where we met.
A comment that you had made a while ago, I was very interested in. I'm trying to kind of fit it into the politics and the dynamics of politics in Ireland. And I want to talk just a wee bit about that. And when you described that the Labour Party, they didn't really understand the voters. That was part of the difficulty. And you went on to suggest that there was a difference between. Well, you explained it. You'll explain it far better than me what you meant by that comment.
After the 29 defeat,
yeah,
2019 defeat. Yeah, I think that there's been. I think the traditional Labour coalition it's a working class party with enough middle class people bolted onto it, if you like, with their interests to create a coalition that actually wins a general election. That's how it's always been. What happened in 2019 is perhaps over a few years, and it's before I get to Jeremy Corbyn, it's not all Jeremy Corbyn's fault. I would preface my remarks, but what's happened with the Labour Party? It's become a middle class party with enough working class people. And that's the wrong way around for a left-wing socialist, democratic socialist, social democratic party to be. And we've had this extraordinary situation in 2019 where constituencies, particularly in the north of England, the so-called Red Wall, which takes you from kind of North Wales right across to kind of Hull, and it dropped down into the East and West Midlands, and this bank of seats that the Labour Party has traditionally called its own. Yeah. Some of them have been marginal. Occasionally, a Tory might have won them now and again, or a Liberal Democrat might have won them. But in the main, it's Labour territory. And what's happened in the 29 election is that Red Wall has just been partly demolished. And you've got Conservative MPs in seats that you would never have dreamt in a million years you'd have a Tory. I mean, the seat that I always come back to is Lee, which is next door to Bolton, which is between Bolton and Wigan, where I'm from, which is an ex-mining area, which has been Labour since this constituency was ever first created, and it's now got a Tory MP. And that happened in northwest Durham, again a mining area. It happened in Bolsover, where Dennis Skinner was kicked out of Parliament after 50 years. A household name, a great character, booted out. That happened in lots and lots of constituencies, and there were lots more where it could have happened there too. Barnsley, which is next to Sheffield, which is the epicenter of the miners' strike.
Yeah.
You look at the seats there. The only thing that stopped some of those seats going Tory was the fact that Nigel Farage's party, the Brexit party, stood candidates there in some of these Labour seats and split the vote. And I think otherwise the Tories probably would have won those places. That would have been shattering if that would have happened. But as I say, there's an awful lot still to unpick from 2019 and to terms with exactly what happened. Now we live in times when all kinds of things can wax and wane very quickly in this day and age. But I mean, the mountain that Keir Starmer's got to climb is enormous, and it starts with winning back these red wall seats and becoming a recognisably democratic social democratic party with an appeal to working class voters and their lifestyles and their aspirations, and meeting those aspirations and not getting pulled as much into the kind of entity politics milieu which just turns off these working class voters. Brexit, when Brexit happened, Brexit was again an agglomeration of frustrations that people had for very many years. It wasn't necessarily a kind of we just really dislike aspects of the European Union or we want sovereignty. It wasn't that kind of abstract debate. It was a sense of it. There was a frustration with immigration, there was a frustration with housing, there was a frustration with public services, state of the economy, jobs, and all the rest of it. Everyday concerns which played back to, in some way, Europe is responsible for this. So the way to kind of address these issues and to give a kick in the pants to the British political establishment was to vote for Brexit. So lots of these Labour areas that went Tory in 2019 voted for Brexit. 1 in 3 Labour voters voted for Brexit in 2016, and there wasn't a recognition that actually these frustrations are deep-seated, and we're just not listening to these areas, and we're not doing enough for them in their everyday lives to make them stick with the Labour brand and not switch to the Tories. Now, I think this is much more about an impulse, hopefully, and people are saying, well, if I'm frustrated with the red team, the only place for me to go really is to the blue team. So that's what I'll do, and hopefully what will happen is they'll come back to the red team. But we don't know that for a fact. It hasn't happened in Scotland. The kind of what's happened in Scotland in the 2015 election is Labour lost 40 Scottish seats. Again, Scotland's the Labour Party's backyard. I think nearly half of every Labour, nearly half of all Labour leaders have been Scottish. It's a beating heart of the Labour movement in lots of ways, and that's gone to the SNP. Again, partly with the issue of independence, with lots of people from that traditional Labour voting Scottish background, which you can characterise in great measure as a kind of Celtic supporting west of Scotland Irish Catholic heritage Scots, who were the strongest Labour supporters there were. They upped and shifted to the independence side of the equation, and by extension the SNP, and that's now where they're parked. So Labour in Scotland at the moment is stone cold dead, and the question is, can Labour be revived in Scotland? I'm very doubtful. Can it be revived in the Red Wall area? Well, if it can't, Labour's finished, so it has to be. And what is the appeal that's going to turn, as I say, those voters from the blue camp to the red camp again? And I think that's a work in progress, and it needs to be the central focus of everybody in the leadership of the Labour Party.
I know that we had John McDonnell here at a Phila event last year, and he spoke about the pending Labour victory, which I couldn't see any signs of. In fact, I'm conscious of the conscious that opinion polls can tell you anything if you pursue them, and if you become hypnotized by them, you become complacent or you become paranoid or whatever. But his absolute certainty that Labour was going to sweep the boards, they were going to just clean up. People were fed up with the Tories. Brexit had been a disaster and all of that. And I kind of, in the audience, I went, this isn't, even from the distance of Ireland, looking at this situation, there was no sign that was likely to be the case. And I know you've dealt very gently with Jeremy Corbyn, and I know that you may be a critic of his politics, but you're certainly not a critic of the man. And you make the point of saying, he didn't want the job anyway. It isn't that he was hunting for the job, but that move to what appears to be Tory values and the red wall, do you think, is it a temporary thing? Can it be reversed? Can Stammer do it?
I think it is. Hope springs eternal, and I think it is a temporary phenomenon. I think there was just a particular moment, and there was a combination of factors. The Brexit debate was kind of everywhere, and I think there was the genuine mood of the public was, for God's sake, can we just get somebody to resolve this and reconcile this? And I think that the difficulty for Labour at that time is that it had a policy of granting a second referendum. It crept to that point of kind of accepting that, because it feared that it was going to lose some seats to the Liberal Democrats, who were emphatic that there should be a second referendum. We should ignore the first referendum and have a second referendum. And Labour got pulled towards that because it thought it was going to lose some of these Lib Dem seats. Now, what happened was the Lib Dems just dissolved. And what happened was all those voters who were frustrated that their choice, as they saw it, was being ignored in these red wall areas, voted Tory, because they were the only ones that were going to get Brexit done, as the slogan had it. So Labour's policy on Brexit was a disaster. It was an absolute disaster. It was trying to avert one problem, and it just created a bigger problem. And it's whether, perhaps with a few years down the line, and those people may well come back. I suspect they will, or they will in part. One of the other factors was Jeremy Corbyn and the position of the Labour Party. Generally, in 2019, if you roll back 2 years, obviously before that, we had another general election where it was expected that Labour under Jeremy Corbyn would do very, very badly against Theresa May when she wanted to, have an election to get a mandate to sort of push forward, all the rest of it. And it just obviously blew apart because Theresa May ran a dreadful campaign, and Jeremy Corbyn ran quite a good campaign. I remember saying to somebody at the time, I said, what you've got to remember about somebody like Jeremy Corbyn is he's a classic street politician. He's comfortable talking to people, and the imagery of an election campaign counts for a lot. And people are not necessarily listening to the fine detail, but they're watching the TV and thinking, how do these people come across? How do they look? What's their non-verbal communication like, as we would call it in the comms world? And Corbyn was comfortable in his skin, and he's talking there to loads of people, and he gets on a soapbox or whatever, and he's chatting away, and he's fine. Whereas Theresa May was very, very stilted and a very poor political campaign. It wasn't her forte. So what happened in that campaign was that Labour went from a position of being the underdogs to actually not winning the election, but depriving Theresa May of an overall majority. She was trying to increase the majority, and she ended up losing it. Yeah. And I remember I was actually in the last week I was actually waiting to do a reaction interview with a broadcaster about the result, and everybody had their kind of stories about how it was Theresa May gets across the line and all the rest of it, and then the exit poll came in, which confounded everybody. And then, like 1 minute later, you're on the radio trying to make sense of this, and a series of people were just going, "Oh my God, what's happening?" And you're checking to see whether the BBC site's been hacked. So you go to Sky. Sky's got the same result. Have they been hacked? Go to ITN. No, everybody's saying the same thing. And there was this moment where Jeremy Corbyn did pretty well on a very kind of traditional socialist platform, and there was a moment where you think, wow, this is interesting, because this has not been melted down. And the traditional argument has been, if you've got a left-wing Labour leader, you will not carry the country. The English people just won't have it. And actually, here they were, seemingly having it, voting for it. And I think what happened then was that by 2019 you've got a different Tory party, a different Tory leader. You've got, the particularly the right-wing newspapers, which carry less weight than they used to, but are still significant in setting the agenda, going for Corbyn pretty relentlessly. He's obviously, he's a classic campaigning backbench MP, which means that he's spoken with lots of groups on the margins and on the fringe and all the rest of it. He's been photographed with lots of people, and he was talking to Sinn Féin when it wasn't fashionable to do that, and he was talking to Hamas, and he's been so it's very easy to pigeonhole him as left-wing, extreme, dangerous, shouldn't be prime minister, and that kind of wore on him a little bit, really. And the difficulty of managing the Labour Party, where you've got the grassroots that are very enthusiastic for Jeremy Corbyn and joining huge numbers to support him and participate in the leadership election that got him in 2015. But in the middle bit, his MPs, very much from the different tradition in the Labour Party, a pre-Corbyn tradition, and lots of them wouldn't work with him, wouldn't work on the front bench with him. And I've written a lot about that. That was a huge mistake. Jeremy Corbyn won on a clear mandate. There was a second leadership election the year after. He won on a bigger mandate, right? He's got a mandate to lead this party, and you've got to kind of live with that, and you've got to work with it. And there's no point being sullen and sitting on the sidelines, which lots of moderate MPs did foolishly, I think. And of course, then all of this weight of managing a difficult party, having a position on Brexit, the issue of the hour, which was ridiculously convoluted. The Labour position was that they would try and renegotiate a better deal than the Tories were doing, with safeguards on social issues and labour standards and environmental standards. They would bring that back, and then they would have a second referendum on it. So you could have had a situation where a Labour government is bringing back its deal only for the Labour Party to campaign against its own Labour government's deal, which is just a ludicrous position. But that was Labour policy going into the 2019 election. And classically, Boris just said, vote for me, I'll get it done.
And I think you're right. I think that the media isn't the force that it had been in the past, but it is a considerable force. But he was an easy target. It was an easy kind of the loony left, and they don't know what they're doing, and one part of the party saying that and the other. Ireland's relationship with the British Labour Party is in many ways not been a healthy one, as you know. For instance, the hunger strikes were a product of Callaghan and Merlin Rees and people like that. How thought out they were is different. I don't know. It's a different situation. So it was very refreshing for me to hear you when you spoke at the Scéalta event in 2017. Talking about the inevitability of Irish unity, and that it would be driven by the economy, the economics of the day, the fallout of Brexit, and all of that. And then I went on to read a blog that you wrote, and you and Mary Lou quoted Lenin about a decade, and sometimes nothing happens in a decade, sometimes a decade happens in a week. So two things I'd like to ask you. First of all, the Brexit fallout that we are now all on the receiving end of, are you still as confident? Because when you spoke pre the Boris Johnson deal, but are you still as confident, analytically confident that the inevitability of Brexit, however it shapes, can lead, not will lead, but can lead to an economic unification of the island of Ireland? Do you still have that feeling?
Oh, definitely. I think the argument about Irish unity is that the strength of it is that it doesn't rely on just one thing. Brexit, has been, as I keep saying, an accelerant. It's been poured over all these other issues that were there anyway. And a match has been thrown on them, and it's gone up. So Brexit is absolutely crucial because it accelerates things that might have taken longer to get there. But underlying Brexit are the longer term, more gradual changes anyway. The demography of Northern Ireland, the election results that we're seeing, the fact that we've got in the Good Friday Agreement a route map that's been agreed and is laid out that takes us to that border poll. It's not an aspirational, we would like a border poll. There is a proviso for a border poll. So some of these elements are already kind of in place, and what we've seen with Brexit is it's sharpened up some of these issues and made them much more urgent. So, for example, the State of the Union, to start at the top. Scotland went to the polls in 2014 for the referendum on Scottish independence. That result, is still extraordinary and very poorly understood, I think, by Westminster. You've got an argument that went from kind of the high 20s in the polls. Do you want an independent Scotland? And through the course of a campaign where Westminster kind of threw everything at it, please don't go. David Cameron says, please don't go. Look, Richard Branson says, please don't go. David Beckham says, please don't go. We're better together. Please don't go. And the Scottish people ignored all of that. And the argument went from the kind of 28, 29% in the polls to 45% on polling day. Now, if that campaign had have carried on another week, another 2 weeks, would it have got past 50% then? Possibly. But I think what's happened there is that what's happened since then in 2014, and we're only talking 6-7 years ago anyway, is that then you get Brexit 2 years later. So if the argument had been put to bed in 2014, look, we've had the vote, there shouldn't be another one now for a period of years. What you get in 2016 is 63% of Scots wanting to stay in the European Union and being dragged out by English votes. So the whole issue then changes and sharpens up again because Brexit is an existential threat to parts of the Scottish economy that rely on the much more European in terms of their focus. And Scots are saying, look, we're not being dragged out against our will by those guys down south. So the issue of independence comes back round again, and it's got a new issue to talk about, which is Brexit. And you look at the polls, at the state of the polls at the moment, where I think there's been 20 opinion polls on the trot, which have shown more than 50% of Scottish voters want independence, and we'll see that tested in May, assuming that elections go ahead as reasonably normal with COVID in the Scottish Parliament elections. And again, if the SNP does dramatically well, then it's going to put things into a bit of a tailspin, because they will want that second referendum. And when Westminster is dealing with the Scottish political establishment, Nicola Sturgeon doesn't lead a little fringe pressure group. She's effectively the Prime Minister of Scotland. She's the leader of the Scottish government. So the idea that you can just ignore this and say, well, you had your vote, we're not giving you another one, I just don't think is going to hold water, because I think that pressure will just keep piling on and piling on. Now, what we then get in 2022, of course, is elections in the north. Similarly, again, will there be a tilt? Will there be a tilt away from unionism and towards parties that are explicitly supporting a border poll? And I think for me that's the interesting metric in the elections there in a couple of years' time. Is I think it's going to be incredible that parties like Alliance, for example, which are the beneficiaries at the moment of the collapse of the centre of the DUP, it's incredible for the Alliance Party not to have a position on a border poll in 2022. It's got to tell people, is it a party that would support holding a border poll or not? And I think it's as stark as that. And I think if you were to see in 2022 a plurality of parties that had a plurality of the vote that were in favour of holding a border poll, doesn't mean yay to United Ireland necessarily, but it recognises this issue is upon us, and then a majority of the parties had that position, then I think it would be very difficult for a British government to hold off much longer from having a border poll in Northern Ireland as well. So at the very top of the tree, the State of the Union, you've got constitutional fire number 1, which is likely to be lit this May, and you've got constitutional fire number 2, which is likely to be lit the following May. And this is at the time when you've got a Boris Johnson government, if he's still there, that's its midterm, that's looking towards the next election, which has got public finance problems because of COVID, possibly because of Brexit and the problems that may occur there, that may be floundering in the polls and floundering politically. It may just think, look, can I take 2 difficult issues out of my in tray and do something with them? And that may be how this pans out.
And it's hard to imagine, given the pragmatism that drives most political parties, in the middle of this this change, the sea change, that the very moment when the union needs to be sold and defended, if you're a unionist, the DUP opt out and are not talking to anyone at the moment around the issue of Brexit. It's beggars belief as to where that strategy comes from.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I mean that's it. These pieces are moving very quickly and are very dynamic at the moment. And I think the central thing, particularly in British politics and people in the Liberal Democrats, the moderates in the Labour Party, the kind of what's left of the pro-European one nation Tories, people are looking for somebody to press a reset button that returns us back to the kind of factory settings of 10, 15 years ago. And there's some normality where the constitutional question doesn't loom over us, where Brexit's kind of not happened, and that there's a kind of normality to British politics again. And there's no reason to believe that will ever happen, that this may just be the new normal. This may just be it.
Yeah.
Brexit's not going to go away as an issue. We're not going to suddenly rejoin, although, I suspect in the next 20 years, 10 to 20 years, Britain will rejoin the European Union. I think that will happen, but it's not going to happen in the next 5 to 10 because of the kind of outworkings of all of this anyway. So it's possible that all kinds of dramatic change takes place, and we live in very dramatic, exciting political times. And it's very possible that Scotland goes. It's very possible that Northern Ireland goes. There's even a growing independence movement in Wales. I mean, Wales voted for Brexit even more so than England did. English voters did, and there's the number of people campaigning for Welsh independence has just gone through the roof at the moment. There's even a movement in Yorkshire where I live for effectively for a Yorkshire UDI as well, where they want to deal with the government where Yorkshire takes control of far more of its economic powers than it's ever done before. So these kind of centrifugal forces are happening all over the British state anyway. Northern Ireland is just one part of that. This is happening everywhere. We've got metro mayors that have come in the last 5 years as well. Again, looking at trying to bring devolution down to the bigger cities and conurbations and pull powers and pull finance away from Westminster. So this is the mood of the time, really. So I suspect Scotland is the biggest headache that Boris Johnson or any British Prime Minister has got for the next few years, and Northern Ireland is their part there as well. As I say, with a route map for how it gets its border poll and perhaps changes the constitutional firmament. So these issues are not going to go away. And Brexit is, as I say, is the accelerant poured over all of this, which has just sharpened everything up. But a lot of these pressures were there anyway. A lot of these issues, were there anyway. We'd have got back to Scottish independence at some stage anyway. But Brexit has just basically regenerated the entire argument. And there is nobody I sense in Westminster that's capable of putting all this back in a box and moving us back and as I say, pressing that reset button and getting things back to normal. I don't think there is a normal anymore.
And of course, the south of Ireland, where Sinn Féin has made substantial dramatic breakthroughs, is part of all that change. You're part of your referendums, you have progressive steps, you have at least a more vigorous opposition than you had in the past. So it's all of that, I think. And it's about seizing that moment, it's about grabbing that opportunity. I'm like yourself, I'm an older person, but I have been involved in politics all my life, and I've heard people getting passionate about a lot of things. I've never heard anybody getting as passionate about the economics of people's lives like yourself. And I know that, and going back to the discussion in Scéalta, that you were saying that it's economics, an economic understanding, an economic rationalization is the key to freedom. It's the key to national freedom, it's the key to individual freedom. Do you see yourself as someone who is in the business of demystifying economics, or is it just that you like to annoy people with how clever you are?
I think it's in terms of the Irish debate, it's absolutely key, because the two interesting things I suppose we've seen, and we're looking obviously at issues of the centenary and all the rest of it. if you go back then, Belfast is this massive industrial hub, this powerful, powerful, important city, strategic economy. And the south of Ireland, outside of Dublin, is obviously, there's no mineral wealth in Ireland, and it's an agrarian society and economy and all the rest of it. And that juxtaposition has been able to say, look, the north of Ireland is just different, and it doesn't fit, and it's closer to Britain. And 100 years ago, that would have been true. But what's happened in the intervening time is, of course, all those staple industries in the north have just disintegrated. They're gone, and they were gone before the Troubles. But obviously the Troubles doesn't exactly help in terms of running a normal economy. And what you get at the far end of even now is that obviously, because of the state of the Northern Irish economy, it's reliant on the subvention from Britain, because it just economically doesn't wash its face. And of course, what's happened down south is that they've jumped over the Industrial Revolution, and they've gone to the knowledge economy. And Ireland is a slick modern economy, very dynamic, very, very focused. I was on a program once on a Sunday morning talking about just about political stuff, and there was a preamble from the business reporter about business news, and I was absolutely amazed at the depth that he went into with issues and the sophistication of the analysis about how Ireland fitted into this global picture. I thought you would never ever get that on any British program, television or radio. You would never get that kind of real interest in international business news that the Irish clearly do have. So it's a very hard-headed, very rational economy down south, whereas the northern economy is now, it's a confection. It's basically, it's a public sector that's obviously very large, for very understandable reasons, and a private sector that's just not grown enough. And actually, the benefit of unity at an economic level is that the south picks up, the north rather, picks up the habits and best practice from the south, increases its productivity and its wealth per head of population as well. So it's a very rational discussion. Yeah. And I'm fond of saying that, where we would have been at one time with the whole issue of Irish unity, this might have been, a couple of old blokes in the back street of a pub lilting the dying rebel. It's not anymore. It's a very hard-headed, very rational, very common sense argument that's rooted in reality and rooted in evidence, and rooted in the future in a way that it's not just an appeal to historical injustices. It's an appeal to, this is the most rational way of running an economy and a state in the 21st century. On an island with a joint population of just 6.4 million people, which is still a very small country. Yeah, so the idea of having two jurisdictions is just nonsense, rationally.
We have been speaking for almost an hour. You'll be surprised to hear, and I promised, and I'm really looking. I want to just finish off in this, your new book. Now, first of all, you do it much better than I. So can you explain? Tell those who are listening the name of the new book.
It's called What a Bloody Awful Country, Northern Ireland's Century of Division. And of course, that's a direct quotation from Reginald Maudling, who was the Home Secretary under Edward Heath, who before there was a Northern Ireland Secretary, when he was Home Secretary, he came over here and held his first meeting with various people here, and went back to Belfast Airport and said to an official, for God's sake, bring me a large scotch. What a bloody awful country, before he flew out again. And he does actually mention this in his memoirs, which I've had the pleasure of reading. And in a sense, he speaks for lots of, what I've tried to do in this book is look a little bit and say, look, the history of the last 100 years is familiar enough to people living there. But I've also tried to just look and reflect a little bit on how it looked at the British political end as well. And what's striking when I've ploughed through some very turgid political memoirs over the last few months is just the sense of God, I just can't get a handle on this place at all, and I can't move it forwards. And as soon as I step onto the tarmac at Belfast Airport, I've been slipping and sliding, and that's been the case the whole time. For every Secretary of State that's been there. You know, and I mean, you know, Maudling, for example, who was Home Secretary, obviously at the time of Bloody Sunday, and made the statement on the Monday in the House of Commons. You know, and just you know, began the kind of process of the whitewash. In his own memoirs, he doesn't even mention Bloody Sunday. I mean, it's not anywhere in his book, which is just seems amazing. Extraordinary.
Yeah.
And you look at a figure like Maudling, who you know will not have been viewed positively, but by the Irish Catholic nationalist Republican community, I have no doubt. But Maudling is still a Tory wet, really. I mean, Thatcher hated the guy, and you know he ended up unfortunately drinking himself to death and was dead by 1979. And you look at that kind of, you know, try to look at the secretaries of state that have passed through, 22 of them so far. You know, most of them have never really gone on to do very much else in politics. It's been a bit of an elephant's graveyard for Westminster politicians coming here, and there's been a lack of imagination at crucial points. And what struck me just looking through, reading through things, is just that moment of thinking, God, if they'd have only done this or that at that point, this might have put things on a different track. If only Harold Wilson's government, you know, had embraced fully and early and emphatically the civil rights movement, where would we have been then? Because they end up being quite tough with Stormont and Unionists anyway. And of course, Ted Heath comes in, and you know, Maudling comes back to close the place down. You know, in 1972. But what if in that 5-year period between 67 and 72, 73, kind of, you know, around the time of Sunningdale, if the British state, the British government had got its act together and got a real handle on things and stopped things descending at that point, where would we have been? And I think when you look through the history of the last 100 years, time and again, you come to that point of, if you'd have only done this at that point, it might have pushed things onto a different track, and it might have stopped the history with which we're all too familiar.
Well, it certainly would have saved lives. There's no doubt about that. It would have saved lives.
Yeah.
So let me just run through the kind of end of this. The book's out in April.
It is.
Okay, so given these difficult times and all of that, how can people access the book?
It's already, I think they're doing pre-sales online at the moment already, so it's on Amazon and published by Biteback, so it's on the web. It's easy enough to find.
I described you as a prolific blogger, and that's an understatement, I have to say. When I was trying to research this interview, I have ended up with pages and pages of quotations of others quoting you, not necessarily your own quotes. So people should follow your blog. It's very important. I think you point to something in the whole desire for Irish freedom that is perhaps missing, and that's the economics, the common sense of moving forward economically for all our benefits. You write for the Guardian and you write for the New Statesman.
I've written for quite a few places over the years, just as a freelancer. I don't tend to write as prolifically these days with one thing and another, but yeah, I'm not short of opinions.
The reason I'm saying that is I think that you bring to the Irish situation a fresh pair of eyes, and people would be well to do with following it. On those final words, and we didn't get covering half of what I wanted to cover. I hope you covered what you got covered. Thank you for being my guest. It's been fascinating. I don't make predictions, and I know you don't either. I actually looked at a quotation from you, and it said, I don't give advice and I don't make predictions. So I don't give advice and I don't make predictions, but we will have you back on Scéalta. So from Scéalta to you, thank you. Good luck with the book, and we'll talk to you then.
All the best to you. Bye-bye.